Welcome everyone to another edition of SIG Connect 365. Today we're going to be discussing something making complex simple, how Dallas College streamlined workflows without code. It's going to be presented by SIG in partnership with Dallas College and FormAssembly. Before we kick it off, let me go through a few housekeeping items. If we advance to the next slide.
That's me. Okay, yep.
All good. As you can tell, everyone will be automatically muted for the duration of this webinar. Please use the Q&A section to submit questions. This is different than the chat section, so make sure you navigate to the Q&A section, and we'll do our best to answer the questions either during the session or at the end during the Q&A section. We are recording this webinar, and it will be shared with everyone who has registered for this event within the next week. Before I turn it over to our presenters, we're going to do a quick poll if you would take a minute to just answer a few things or one question. So let's see. Do you see the poll? There we go.
Appreciate the reactions too. I saw some thumbs up floating up. I always love those, so please feel free to emoji throughout our presentation.
Good stuff. All right, looks like we got about half participating. Oh, a few more still coming in. All right. While this is still up, I'm going to turn this over to our presenters. So if you advance to the next slide, we're going to start with Anna. Anna, if you'd like to take it away.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for being here. My name is Anna Bailey, and I'm a senior consultant at Strata Information Group, or SIG. And I've been a Salesforce consultant for about 5.5 years now. And when I first met Salesforce, well, that would be 8, 9 years ago now, I also met FormAssembly at the same time. So I've always been a big fan of the tool, kind of learned this alongside Salesforce, and have had the great pleasure of working with Brad and Robin, and very excited that they are joining us here today to talk about FormAssembly. And then we've got Skylar here, so I'll let everybody introduce themselves. And yeah, our general format today is going to be kind of a discussion where we get to hear from Brad and Robin about their learning curve, learning process, some of the things that they have accomplished with FormAssembly over the years. So Brad, I will hand this off to you to introduce your own self.
Hello, I'm Brad Portner. I am the Senior Director of the CRM team at Dallas College. I have been with Dallas College for going into my 10th year this year. I started off as a web developer, mostly .NET, C#, JavaScript, working on the SharePoint platform. And about 2 to 3 years ago, I was introduced to Anna in the Salesforce world. So I've been working with Salesforce for the last couple of years, and we have been using FormAssembly about the same length of time. And I'll turn this over to Robin.
Hi, everyone. My name is Robin Kim. I am a software engineer here at Dallas College. I also act as a Salesforce administrator. When I first joined the team, my boss, Brad, told me that, get familiar with FormAssembly and Salesforce. So those are the two softwares that I picked up, when I got started here at Dallas College. I primarily now just regulate, our users, profiles, permission sets, things like that in Salesforce, along with some automations we have set up for our processes. But other than that, that's pretty much it about me, and I will pass it along to Skylar.
That's me. Hey, everybody, you might have guessed it, from the shirt, but I'm Skylar Rogers from FormAssembly. Not in Dallas, but just down the road in Austin myself. I recently started here at FormAssembly, but as I've sort of gotten up to speed, I get to do a lot of stuff on the product and the messaging side, and part of that's getting to meet all kinds of customers, hearing their stories, kind of bringing that, to others who might be in need of a solution like this as well. So it's always great to be able to show up and shout out FormAssembly, but also shout out, great teams like Dallas College and the stuff that they're doing as well. Really happy to be here.
All right, and Skylar's got a couple of words about FormAssembly before we dive into our discussion.
Yeah, like I said, always happy to give it a shout out. But if you haven't heard of FormAssembly before today, I bet you've probably run into it, right? We've been around for going on 20 years now, believe it or not. As you can see, kind of on one of these introduction slides, we set ourselves up as a data collection platform. You might be saying, well, data collection, I thought we were just talking about forms today, but no, this is really how we like to kind of frame how we, build the software and its solutions, right? Like if you think about what I like to say is that a form is never just a form. Um, hopefully that resonates with you, in the audience or the Dallas College crew, because a lot of steps go into a form before it's on the screen. A lot of steps go into the data that goes into that form after, someone hits enter on it, right? So a lot of that gets thought about. A lot of that gets built into, the process and the features in form assemblies. You'll hear a little bit about today. The other slide here calls out this notion of collecting, connecting, protecting. And that's really what's sort of driving a lot of the features and functionality that we like to show off, and thankfully our customers like to talk about as well. But collecting that information, making it very simple. A lot of forms vary almost infinitely in the complexity and things that you can gather and a number of steps. And then connecting as well. What happens to that data, after it gets entered, like I mentioned, maybe some of the teams listening have wasted a lot of time on manual processes and kind of following up on that information after it gets entered somewhere or lost in a spreadsheet or forgotten in some database somewhere. But what if you could connect that fairly easily, likely to Salesforce, and not need an admin every single time that you have to set up a new form or set up a new connection? We've thought about those sorts of processes and sort of built them into the flow with form assembly, along with a drag and drop form builder. So that's become really popular over the years, but that last step we should never forget about as well is protect that information. So it's one thing to have an easy to build form builder, to have these great connections to your systems of record, but is that data passing through in a safe way? Is it staying compliant, with the various ways that we need to protect our data to, operate in our various industries, higher education and others, right? So collect, connect, protect. We like to think about all three phases of that when we think about a data collection platform. Yeah, that's a little bit of context on form assembly itself. If you have questions about it, we love talking about this stuff, as you can tell by the way I'm rambling on. We'd be happy to answer questions about it, but hopefully you hear something that maybe gives you some inspiration and ideas today from the Dallas College crew.
All right. Well, thank you, Skylar. Really appreciate the background, and I always, appreciate a good rhyme to start off a webinar and to make things memorable. So yeah, we will get started. We're gonna this will be discussion format here. So just a quick comment from me. I mean, it has been I had the privilege of working alongside Brad when he was first coming online with Form Assembly, and Robin as he joined the team, and it's just been I mean, I specifically was very excited to have Robin join us, kind of seeing this like from the first time you see the tool to now, in some of our more recent conversations, Robin's out there building really complex things and saying, okay, does this, let's just review this, and we get to say, look at that. So I mean, it's been such a privilege to kind of work alongside and kind of participate as somewhat of a coach. It's one of my favorite parts about my job. So this feels like a very nice full circle moment. So thank you, Robin, for kind of bringing in the here's the learning process kind of perspective here, and Brad, one of the first times I met you, you were kind of sorting out some things with a form request, and so it's very easy to think of both of you when we're thinking about form assembly. So yeah, we want to talk through kind of starting simple, like for those folks that are maybe looking for a form tool, or getting started, like there's this kind of build that happens, right? And you start to learn things and get more into it. So let's just kind of follow that arc, that story. And so, yeah, we'd love to hear kind of some of your initial experiences kind of as a, admin, as a builder. And then, yeah. So, Brad or Robin, would love to hear from you on this one.
I'll jump in. So I would say the initial experience with FormAssembly was pretty straightforward. I mean, it's a nice, straightforward tool. The WYSIWYG is great. You get to drag and drop your questions. You get to move things around. You have panels on the screen. I don't think there's a giant learning curve for the initial creation of a simple form. The learning curve is going to kick in whenever you start doing the conditionals and you start adding in your, hidden fields versus what's not hidden and multi-page. And but that initial, just build is actually pretty clean. I think I've got people on the team now who, if I get a request for a form, I can reach out to a couple people on the team and say, hey, can you build the form? I'll have someone else help you connect the fields back in Salesforce. So that's something that we've kind of leaned on in the last couple months, where I've got people who are familiar enough with FormAssembly to build a form that we can then go and clean up and iterate through to make it a better form. But the initial experience, I think, is great. It's not a hard to learn tool. It is pretty straightforward, and most of the connectors are fairly straightforward. I don't think I've really had any problem hooking up anything on the back end of the FormAssembly side either.
And I'll also chime in here. Like Brad was saying, it's pretty straightforward, as in it's like very user friendly, and the interface is very easy to use. I think Skylar pointed out, it's a lot of drag and drop. You get to pick, which kind of content you want, and add fields like text boxes and pick lists here and there. I think Brad kind of also touched on this. It gets a little more intricate when you maybe do add some sort of code to your form. Like let's say if you want to hide certain buttons, you can do that with CSS, things like that. So it can get a little more complex, but my initial thoughts when Brad told me to, just start getting familiar with FormAssembly, I thought it was very familiar. And, the more and more you end up building and creating these forms, the easier it gets. And then, you just end up building on top of that. So yeah, like he was saying, it's very simple, easy to use with that drag and drop feature. That's what I love about it.
And I would add that I've used other form tools in the past. I've used Microsoft Forms. I've used Turbo Builder was another one I used years ago. And out of all of the different tools that I've seen or used, I think FormAssembly is probably the easiest to pick up. Some of the other ones have been fairly complicated on the back end. Microsoft Forms is very easy just because it has very few options that you can actually use. But out of the commercially available tools, I think FormAssembly is actually probably one of the easiest to pick up and use.
Nice. Excellent. Yeah, thank you both. So maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the the things that you were able to do maybe earlier on in your FormAssembly, experience some of the use cases, some of the forms that you interacted with, and and maybe rather than, I have the questions up here, but you kind of talk about what you created and that learning process along the way for some of the more kind of earlier use cases for you.
So the first thing that we were really tasked with building, we were working with our continuing education group to build out some of their paper processes in Salesforce in a workflow. They have some forms that are upwards of 60 to 70 questions, and they're pretty complicated depending on what they're answering. And I spent a lot of time working with that group saying, okay, you have these questions, can we separate them out into separate forms? And then on the back end, you have one view that you can print out in a report. That was difficult from the perspective of having them work through their processes and work through their flow, because they couldn't get off the mindset, well, it's all on this one sheet of paper. So they couldn't get away from that. And we had to show them that, hey, you're having somebody fill out 70 questions on this form. You're going to have a lot of responses that are just not there because people give up and they don't fill out, long forms. I think that one of the biggest things that we accomplished was being able to sit down with these groups and go, okay, here's the form. This is what it looks like when we have all 70 questions. Or here's what it looks like when we separate it out into 3 forms. And you send the people individual links as they finish one form. It's like, hey, you have this other thing you need to fill out as part of your list or checklist. And then they go fill that out. And we pre-fill information on that form based on responses from the previous form or from their contact information in Salesforce. I think that was one of the first big things that we kind of accomplished using FormAssembly was setting up those query string parameters and setting up those pre-fills from either their single sign-on if they're a student, or coming out of a contact record that we send them an email that says, here's your link to your specific form, please fill this out. And Robin, do you have anything to add there?
And I know you kind of touched on this a little bit, Brad, and I think it's like organizationally a more mature thing, but FormAssembly wise, like more on the early stages of learning. So but you had mentioned that you do have some folks that you can kind of like have them build like the front end and then, kind of hand that over to, folks like Robin and, who can kind of get into the more nitty gritty. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about like that. I mean, we talked about it's easy and intuitive, but just like that learning process, or how when you like say, hey, you can come in and be a front end form builder, like what does that look like to kind of provision somebody and get them started on that?
So FormAssembly gives you several different options when it comes to their access levels. I don't think we utilize them quite as heavily. We pretty much have everybody that's a licensee as an admin on our system, but we only have 25 people who can access. But you can turn it over to someone who may not have the back-end knowledge to connect a form to whatever system. It may be Salesforce, it may be a Power Automate flow, whatever we're connecting to. You can say, hey, here's the fields I need. Please go build this form and then demo me the form. Show me what it looks like. Let's show the stakeholder what they're asking for. And the stakeholder can say, yeah, I like that form, or no, I don't. And we can revise it long before we ever hook it up to the back end system. When we do hook it up, I can turn it over to Robin, or I have another couple people on my team. I can say, hey, please go see which fields we already have in Salesforce, and do we need to create any new fields in our sandbox to test out with before we move this form forward. I think that's one of the great pieces of FormAssembly. When you do create a form in FormAssembly, one of the best things you can do is tag them. I think putting a dev tag on your initial form and then cloning it before you make it a live form is one of the best things you can do, because then you have two copies. I think we learned the hard way that people will come and ask for changes to a form. And if you don't have two copies of it, one dev, one live, you're sitting there making changes on a live form. Sometimes that breaks a whole lot of things. It's better to change the dev form and then either swap them out, where the dev form is now the live form and then the live form is now dev, than it is to try to do that manipulation. But you can certainly hand it over to people who don't have that back end experience or that programming knowledge to build the initial look and feel. You can even take what's done and you can turn it over to, let's say, a web team in marketing or whoever. They can take that, I don't know where it is in the form, I think it's under publishing. You can copy paste the code, or you can download the form, edit it to fit into an iframe or into an embedded part of your web page. So you don't even actually see a form. It's all embedded in your web page. That's a little bit more advanced. I know that's way past this initial conversation, but yeah, you can definitely do that. You can have people who are not familiar with that tool, they're not familiar with Salesforce, but if they have any front end knowledge or any form building knowledge, or just aesthetically, if they know how to build something aesthetically, they can drag and drop all day, show it to your stakeholders. They can go, yeah, I really like how that looks. And then you can take your back end devs and then you can hook everything up.
Excellent. Thank you. Let's get into some more complex use cases. This is like, once you kind of cross over, it's like you kind of think of everything in this whole set of capabilities. So I appreciate you kind of thinking about those earlier light cases. And I know we've kind of touched a little bit on some of these. But I'd love to just kind of hear you talk a little bit about you mentioned some of the redirects, or and I think we have the pre-fill on our next slide and the more advanced, but yeah, maybe talk through a few of the some of the features that you've used, and then I have a few comments I'd like to make about how awesome you guys are. But please go ahead and share a little bit about what FormAssembly does for you.
So in the redirect category, in fact, on this slide, I provided Anna with a couple of images here. We have a CE interest form that has some basic questions in the beginning of the form that either hide or show more information. So one of the questions is, I plan on paying for this class myself, or I need assistance paying for the course. If the user selects, I plan on paying for the class myself, and they submit the form, then they're redirected based on that choice to a thank you page that just says, or I'm sorry, it's the CE registration page. They get sent to a page that says, hey, here, click here to go register for your CE class because you're paying for it yourself. If they choose, I need help, then they have to fill out a lot more information on the form because it's determined what grant funding they may be available for them. And if they answer that, they're sent to a separate thank you page that basically says, hey, you're going to be receiving an email from us, and you're going to be reached out to by a college coach, and we'd like you to go ahead and fill out this other application, because they're separate processes. If we had used the simple notification message where somebody has to read one message and kind of decode that, that may not work for the population that we're trying to help, because some of the folks filling out this form are either people who are looking for GED or they're looking for ESL programming. So we don't want to confuse people even more by giving them, here, there's option 1. If you said this, here's option 2. So we found a way to use the if statement in the redirects to actually redirect to multiple pages, which is something I could do in code if I was writing this as a custom, coded website. But since it is in FormAssembly, we had to work through figuring that out. And it was not terribly hard to figure out. It was just one of those things we had to play around with it for an hour or two till we got it to where we wanted. I think it's a really strong feature to be able to base your redirect at the end of your form on what someone chooses. So that actually is very helpful for us.
Yeah, I love that use case. And I think the point of, you don't want to say, thank you for submitting your form. If you said this, click here. If you said that, click on this other link. And like, you've made that decision based on something they already said. And there's, Brad provided this screenshot here. There is a little formula builder that can help you, like, you see the syntax of like the field names and labels and things like that. And I will also take this opportunity to say I am always impressed and super grateful for the FormAssembly documentation. Like, you're like, what was that again? I haven't done that in a couple of months. I know I did that. I think I did that here. What is the syntax for that? And there's so much out there. So anyways, huge props to you guys.
I'll add to that. I think that they have one of the better wikis and documentations out there that I've seen. I think Robin would probably nod and agree with that one too.
Yep, I agree there.
I think that they've done very well with the documentation. There are some things that sometimes I look and I can't find it, but for the most part, it is there. I would also add into here as well that this does not stop you from, if you're submitting into Salesforce, you have a flow in the back end that fires off something completely different. This is just that initial thank you message that the user gets upon completing the form.
Yeah, and I'll have Brad or Robin talk about how they use SSO. But I think that, like, the Dallas College crew, I mean, as a whole, just collaborates across divisions and departments very well. And I'll let Brad or Robin explain a little bit more about this, but when you are trying to leverage some of the like attributes of SSO, like what can you pull in? I've been very impressed with the flexibility of the kind of the tech team there to say, okay, let's make more attributes available through SSO. And it's really given a huge boost to their forms to be able to like insert maybe some additional attributes that aren't just like first name, last name, email. I've seen you guys use that. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how you use the SSO features, what that does for you. Yeah.
I would say, so setting up the SSO is not necessarily the easiest thing to do, because you have a few options. There's SSO for your users who are logging into FormAssembly, which is a completely separate thing. You also have the ability to create SSO per form. So you set it up one time in Azure, but then you set it, or whatever your IDP is. And then you can go per form and you can have single sign-on enabled for that form. And depending on what attributes that your IDP is delivering through SSO, you can get things like their first name, their last name, their email, their employee address, their employee ID, any attribute that we can get from their AD record or from whatever record we're pulling from. We use Microsoft, so that's going to be Azure. We can pull that into the form as pre-fill information, or we can use that email to match up to their Salesforce contact record, or to, whatever we're using as the identifier. We can pull SSO first, and then we can pull in the contact information off of Salesforce to pre-fill as much as possible. That's actually been pretty powerful for us to be able to create some records. And then we have some cases where they may not have a contact record in Salesforce, but we pull a lot of the information out of SSO to then create the contact record in Salesforce to match that person up to. And we don't use it for every form. There are definitely forms out there that are still anonymous that we don't need the SSO for, but then there's other things that we only want employees or students to submit. And in those cases, that's whenever we wire up to single sign-on.
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, go ahead, Robin. I saw you unmuted.
Oh yeah, I was just going to add to that. Like Brad was saying, SSO is really use case dependent. So really, whenever we want to restrict access to certain people, we'll tag that on there. One example is where we've used it for nursing students in our case, and we only want students that have officially applied to Dallas College to be able to access the application. So they need to have applied through Apply Texas, and then they'll come in as a contact record, which then they can log in and view the form. So really, we just use it as kind of like a layer to where, hey, we want you to do something first before you fill out the application. So I feel like that's where it comes very handy. And as Brad was mentioning, we get those certain attribute values, and then that helps us, maybe do a lookup on Salesforce to get that information into the form where it pre-fills some of their, first name, last name, data points like that. So I feel like it really comes in handy in those use cases.
Excellent. Yes. I appreciate you highlighting the when you might not, all of that. So as we are kind of escalating through in complexity as we're telling this story here, and Brad, you kind of already touched on this a bit about your first form and the discussing through how are we going to go about this. Really, I think it's a very important to spend a few minutes thinking about the kind of how you go about getting to the right answer, right? Getting to the right build. And so there's, the business process design, like the moment that someone's coming from, here's a paper form to, can you digitize this? You can uncover so many questions you didn't know you had, right? So I have 2 bullet points here just about business process design, and it's related, and we've talked a lot over the years about, do we do this part of the process with the connector on the back end from FormAssembly, or do we send it in more raw and then let Salesforce do some of the processing? So there's always, and we've kind of developed some, I don't know, go-to solutions. We've really worked on best practices and things like that. So I just kind of want to open up this topic. I'm not going to go separate these bullet points from a host perspective, but I would love to hear, Brad and Robin, you guys talk a little bit about the process around the process, right? How do you get the best results? What is that like with your collaboration? How do you approach that with the people who are turn this piece of paper into a form for me, and kind of approaching that thinking it's fairly straightforward, but you guys, certainly are hosting a lot of those revision processes now very well. You're getting it so dialed in. It's great to see. But yeah, let's hear from you guys a little bit about that greater process.
So I'll start off with saying that no client ever knows what they want, right? They always come and they say, well, we want this thing to be a digital process that we've had for this paper process for years. And you start pointing out that, well, have you thought about how this goes from point A to point B? Where does the student come from? Where is the link going to live? They don't even think about where they want this to be hosted in the beginning. So you have to start thinking along those lines. I always kind of go in this linear path, and I know that, it's not really the agile way of thinking, but I like waterfall. I like the whole iterative process. So I look at it and I say, okay, where, you have this form. Who is your audience for this form? Who are the students who have to fill this thing out? And when they start talking and you're like, well, you have, again, 70 questions on this form. Can we not break this form out into being a couple of sessions so that when you're working with your student, you get this piece filled out first? Because in some cases, they're with the student when they're filling out the form. Other cases, they're not. So if we're in the case of what we were working with SIG and AKA at the time, we had the Admissions Connect piece going in with checklist items. So we said, why don't we separate these out into separate checklist items? So they do this piece of the form, then they do this next piece, and we can build you a view on the back end to show you the entire answer for the report for the state. But the student can fill it out in sections. That learning process for people outside of IT and programmers, they don't always think that way. They think that they have to fill out something immediately. So it's very important to sit down with a client or group before the project even starts and draw out their existing process and say, okay, let's talk about how you do your job sitting down in front of you every day. How do you do it? And I've actually sent people to, other campuses to sit down at a desk with somebody and watch them do their job so we could write down this is what they're doing, because they can't always explain it to you. I think that's a very important piece of being an analyst, just to have to be able to see what the person's actually doing, because they're not always going to tell you. And as far as, where do we differentiate the automation on the FormAssembly side or Salesforce? I think it's case by case. So you look at whether or not a conditional statement or an if statement in the background or some piece of JavaScript that needs to fire off to change an answer, whatever that may be, does it make more sense for that to happen on the front end prior to submission? Or does it make more sense to submit every piece of raw data and let it flow in Salesforce, or let whatever process pick that up and put it where it needs to be in the system? We've used both, and I think it just is very dependent upon what is being asked. I will say that FormAssembly does a very good job of keeping all those responses so that we can go and say, and in fact, I just had this morning, a student didn't get their Pearl submitted correctly. It's called a personal identifiable record. They said they tried it 3 times, it wouldn't submit. So I finally found it, and the student had put 6 digits in their zip code. So I went back, I corrected it, and I reprocessed the form. It was inserted, no problems. But if FormAssembly hadn't held on to that data in the front end, I wouldn't be able to go look and see what the student was missing. Plus, the error message in FormAssembly was very helpful to say, hey, I couldn't create this record because it's missing this piece, which also let me go and say, hey, I need to make sure that it's 5 digits on the zip code only can be submitted. But we did fix it. The student was submitted, and it's part of that troubleshooting process that we go through. But business processes in general, you have to have your business process down, because if you don't have it down, you're going to end up having to repeat yourself over and over, and you're going to create the form 10 times before they get what they want.
Yeah, and you'd made a point earlier too to talk about like designing the front end and getting that like tested. I feel like that's something that we ended up doing together a lot, and Robin was like just doing a lot too. Is this like, okay, here's the front end, like have at it, give all your feedback, do all of that, and then we kind of start building and connecting. And I think that there's been a lot of great opportunity for learning about some of those, like where's the best time to bring people in. And we've had a lot of conversation where it's easier to give people something to respond to, rather than, because we can picture it because we've done it a bunch of times, where like the other folks maybe haven't, like they're picturing a piece of paper, but it's just, but where and how. I mean, this is something we talk about like in my like SIG Salesforce team, like where and how is it like the right time to show something that's in progress, because you have to know who you're working with too, because if you show somebody something in progress, it can throw them for a loop if they don't know kind of where you're at or what's happening. But if you really set the stage well, it's a great opportunity for collaboration. And I've just in the time that I've been working more closely with Robin, like you guys have been going more to your end users, and then we've been more, a little more background supporting. And so it's been, very cool to see, kind of like every time you're kind of like bringing in a new team or whatever, it's like, okay, get a little bit more dialed in exactly where and how to kind of go through those steps. So Robin, yeah, you want to talk a little bit about your experiences there?
Yeah, I wanted to touch on the business process piece because this is something I've experienced since I've been with Dallas College, is that, you want to ensure your stakeholder kind of sets very specific boundaries on their scope, because there's a tendency where they'll come back at you and they'll be like, hey, I need actually XYZ as well. And then that causes a lot of backtracking and you lose time there. So I think it's really important that they know what their scope is and you really get their process down. And then let's say they do need another feature added on to the form or something like that. You can maybe approach it as kind of like an iterative approach, like, hey, we'll do this for you on the next go live for this form, or something like your first version is going to be like this, and then the next iteration, we'll add that on, something like that. That way you don't have to backtrack and you can just kind of keep going. And as far as it goes for like the automation pieces, I look at it like this, because FormAssembly I feel like is somewhat limited on maybe like the notifications and emails that you can send out depending on certain conditions. Whereas with Salesforce, like Brad was saying earlier, let's say a student falls into a certain bucket, then maybe you can have certain emails be shot out to those students depending on those buckets. For example, like let's say a student fills out a form and it asks the student, hey, are you a credit student, an international student, or a continuing education student? And based on that selection, they'll receive a certain email because they are a credit student or because they are an international student. And it can get more intricate as well, because we have things like where a student's assigned a certain coach depending on their category as well. So that's how I've thought through certain processes on how, where we want automations to take place, whether in Salesforce or FormAssembly.
Yeah, I appreciate that point, Robin, that like, what does the ongoing need of this? Like, you want to have like the same exact letterhead on 3 emails. Well, you're definitely going to send that from Salesforce. And I think another thing that we've spent some time talking about is where, if FormAssembly is your main input or your only input, then you might do more with the form, but you may have a process where, you have some folks coming in through the form. If there's any other onboard for those records to be created in Salesforce at all, then you want to do one time. Like if you need to do something fancy, with the record, like, and it's coming in from a few different sources, then it's like if Salesforce is the common denominator, then do your automation there. So you're not like, well, we did this processing in FormAssembly for the records that come in there, and then we have this upload, and then that's in Salesforce. So just kind of thinking about like your onboarding. So I think that just to kind of summarize that, like, where are the records coming from, and if it's just FormAssembly, then use all the advanced features you can. But if they're coming in from other places, and then as Robin brought up, like for some of those ongoing communications or any automations that would reference like things you knew about them before they filled this form out, like we would have that in Salesforce. So
And I'd like to add that it's never just a simple form. Like, I don't care what someone asks you for. They could be, oh, we just need this little form that people fill out. It's never that simple, because it always turns into, well, we'd like emails from that, or we want to put a campaign on that. There's always something they want to add. So it's never just, hey, here's a simple form. It's always, to my team, I'm always like, hey, never go out there and tell somebody, oh yeah, we knocked that out for you. Just always listen to what they're telling you first, and then get a plan together no matter what you do, and have them sign off. This is what you said you wanted. Yes, we can change this, but that increases your amount of time. It's not like we can just make these changes to what you're asking that simply, especially when you're adding fields that you have to add into Salesforce, or that you have to put somewhere to store that data. Unless you're just literally storing the data in FormAssembly and shipping off an Excel document to somebody, it's not as simple as what they always think.
yeah, and I appreciate that. And Robin, you brought this up, and we have spent so much time talking about this, like, and this has certainly been, I'll say somewhat of a learning curve for me, going from being like a Salesforce admin and business process like person to like a consultant. Like, you always want to say yes. Like, they want one more tweak. Yes, it makes sense. But from the development perspective, you got to set that kind of that line to say, okay, completely reasonable thing to want, but we don't want to impact the timeline. If this is not a blocker for you, let's do like a 2.0, and we can keep working under the scenes, but we really, kind of underneath, but we've got to kind of have a cutoff point. And I think that, that is always, because, typically those of us in these types of services, it's like we want to help people, right? But we talk about this in my team too, and it's, just that, like, okay, actually, unfortunately, we've learned that if I say yes too late in a process, that there's downstream impacts. And so, that's definitely, something that, I don't know, it's been very fun. I'll say, Robin, kind of seeing you kind of becoming more like you've been negotiating those things, and with your team as well. And so I definitely appreciate you bringing that up. And Brad, and just to tie it in, Brad, earlier you mentioned that whole, like, okay, here's our form, we've launched it, it's live. Now that it's like good to go, we're going to clone that. And then then any development requests and things like that can happen on that new version. And this is a little tip that I always like to give. And because of these iterative improvements, I always like to recommend, if you're going to share a link to a form somewhere, don't like email the form link out. Like, if you're like, go fill out our form, like, send people to the page, and then you can kind of like swap out the form link behind it if you need to. Like, if you just are doing your 2.0, you want those emails to send the person to the page where they can fill out the form, where they can find the link and fill it out. But if you send them that static actual form link and you go and change it, then they're going to get the old form link.
And there's a way around that, Anna. You can use the shortcut link, because if you give a form a shortcut link and you say, like we call the form, instead of it being form 222, you do the form assembly shortcut for it to be CCL interest. So whenever you clone the form, you just move the shortcut link to the new form and you kill it off the old one. That works.
Well, see, there we go.
Pretty well.
See, I learn something new every day. Like, I've been using it for long, and there's cool features that I can learn about live in front of everybody. Okay.
And it's actually a really great tool, because it does help you if you're trying to have multiple copies of a form you have to switch through.
Nice. Well, there we go. Excellent. See, okay. So let us continue moving along here. Some of these things that we've already touched on a little bit, but let's talk about some of your advanced use cases. Our screenshots that you provided here are about the Salesforce prefill, where you like send, attributes in. We talked a little bit about that with the SSO. But yeah, talk with the team here about some of your more advanced use cases and how you've stretched form assembly.
So as part of that, workflow conversation, if you have a student who's filling out information that may or may not already be in their contact record or somewhere in an application, and you have a form that asks for that same information, you can pre-fill by using a query string and a URL. As you see on the infographic here, it just says CID. We're using that as their contact ID, and then we pre-fill based on that contact. So once we have that contact ID, anything associated with that contact ID in Salesforce can be pulled into a form. So if we have an associated object that has a relation to that contact ID, we can pull in data from there. We have done things where we hide a field on the form that matches a question from a previous form, like, are you employed, yes or no? And we pull that data in, and then let's say the next form has a question that says, what's your employment status? And if we know that they're employed or unemployed, we can pre-fill employed or unemployed instead of them having to go select it again. That's where it's useful, especially if the question on the secondary form is not exactly the same question, but the answer comes out to be the same. And we have that just from, governmental requirements that people have to answer a certain question a certain way, that they may have answered that they're employed, but then the secondary question says, how many, what is your employment status? It's a completely separate question, but it's the same answer. We've also done things in FormAssembly using custom JavaScript to either add the Google Translate feature into a form, so you can translate the form into multiple languages. That's actually really helpful. We have done things where we drag a drop down onto the screen. We don't put any options in the drop down at all. We then use JavaScript to populate the options, and we hide the submit button until that person makes certain selections. And we did that on our new student orientation because the dates would change frequently. And the new student group would come in and say, hey, we need to close off the event for August the 12th because it's full. And since we're using JavaScript, we just have an array of dates that we would just go comment out that date and it would disappear from the list instead of me having to go edit the form and have to go find the if statement that we're using to find that in the form. So it made our new student orientation form quite a bit easier to read, because instead of using all those Excel formulas, which is basically what FormAssembly's if statements and all are, we were able to do some JavaScript. But that does require someone who knows how to do JavaScript on the front end, or just a programmer in general, to do those things. Robin, is there anything I'm missing?
I like to keep it very low coded if I can as possible. Like another example on top of what Brad just mentioned would be like if you want to, I think I mentioned this earlier, if you want to hide maybe the submit button for a certain reason. One reason, like one use case that I've done that before, or where I've used it before, is where we couldn't really archive the form. That is an option, but we couldn't archive it for, I forget, XYZ reason. So instead of archiving it, we updated it to have a message saying, this form is no longer active, and then I would just use CSS to hide the submit button. That's just like another very low level example of where you can maybe use custom code to fit that use case. So that's like an example I have, but I try to just use the drag and drop as much as possible, along with the conditional feature that FormAssembly does have. So that's kind of my take on very low usage of code.
And I'll add to that, the publishing features in FormAssembly are great, because you can set a date that says, after this date, don't show the form anymore, just show this message that says, thank you, the time for this is past, please wait till next year, or whatever time we open the form back up. I think Robin the case we had was we had turned off the form, and I think on the web page we had hidden the link, but the people who we were about to edit the form for them, they wanted to see the form, and in order to do that, either had to give them access to FormAssembly, or I had to make the form accessible to them, but we didn't want anybody submitting it accidentally. So I think that was the use case. Does that sound familiar, Robin?
Yeah, that sounds familiar, and that was like a new error that we ran into, and that was our workaround for that situation. Yeah. So you always learn something new, and you always fix it on the fly. So that's been my experience.
You're like, oh right, there's a new way to do something, to break it. But yeah, I appreciate the kind of commentary on, for the most part, right, the kind of out of the box features are sufficient. They're complex and nuanced enough to do what you need to. And then there are some times where it's like, if only we could do a little bit more. And I love the fact that there's like a built-in option. If you've got people who can do JavaScript, CSS, some of those types of things, that you can kind of extend to some of those more nuanced validations and things like that. And that's when I have that, I call a developer, but otherwise, I'm a more declarative admin, and I often can take the whole thing all the way through, and I only really call a developer if we really need some of those super advanced features, which I love that there's here's a window, feel free to add that. So
one of the best features I think that's built in is the ability to save and resume a form. So if you do have one of those really long forms like we have, if you turn that feature on, I think it asks them for an email address and they create a password and then they can just come back to that form and continue on with it later on. I think that's actually a really great feature.
Yeah, nice. All right. Well, okay. So I had the question, but we already talked about you collaborating like with your marketing team and whatnot. We've got one more question to discuss, and then Jen will release one more poll. And then we are kind of nearing our end time here. If you have any questions, we do have a Q&A panel. So keep an eye out for that poll popping up here soon. And if you do have any questions, feel free to start dropping those in. And yeah, just kind of would like to close the discussion with, kind of thinking about the successes that you've had. We've heard a lot of great stories of use cases and things like that, but would love to hear either a specific story to emphasize the success or kind of overall, how, what some of the successes that you guys have had.
I think the overall overarching success that we've had is we have utilized FormAssembly now for almost every supplemental application that comes through Dallas College for a lot of our CE and continuing education and or credit programs. So you fill out a Dallas College application through Apply Texas, you get into our school, but then if you want to be in a program like Vet Tech or a program like nursing, they require some additional information. So using FormAssembly to create those supplemental applications has been very helpful to us. Our first major group that moved into FormAssembly was our continuing education career connected learning group. They are using it every day, daily, all the time. So we have thousands of forms filled out. I think I just looked at one today. We had over 10,000 responses to it. So it's being heavily used. And, Robin is working on, they just finished up with another group, which was experiential learning. So we're moving on to more groups in Dallas College that are asking us to create their applications and their supplemental forms. So it is a very successful piece of technology. I've used it personally as well. Like if we have a group that doesn't have Salesforce access, but they need a form, I've actually been successful in creating a Power Automate link in the back end to dump the JSON data from the form into SharePoint list. So I wish there was a hint FormAssembly. I wish there was a connector straight to SharePoint list, but we have done it in the past. We've used it to connect to different platforms, and it actually works really well. So I think overall, it's just a great tool to be able to use.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Brad. Robin, any closing remarks or success stories that you'd like to share?
I think Brad's, touched on most of my talking points as well. It does take in all of our like supplemental applications, but a form is a form, and typically they're used for a lot of things like signing off on waivers or reading through guidelines and just acknowledging them. So I think it's helped us in a lot of areas where it pertains to that. Like for example, nursing has a lot of acknowledgements that students have to check off on. One of the very first forms I actually created was a virtual reality waiver form, and it kind of works the same way. Students given some guidelines on the equipment they're about to use, and they sign off on a waiver and they're able to use it. So that was one of the first things I ever created using FormAssembly. So I think it comes in very handy when it's those use cases where you want someone to read and sign off on something. So that's one of the biggest successes.
Nice. Excellent. Well, thank you both so much for your time and your partnership over, these years and all the FormAssembly fun we've had. And yeah, I really appreciate you kind of coming in and sharing the story and the examples. If we are happy to take any questions. There is a Q&A window. Our webinar doesn't let folks unmute and speak, but we'd be happy to do so. And just thank you so much to the FormAssembly team for helping pull this together, for their partnership, and just kind of pulling things together. So Skylar or Jen, I'm not seeing any questions. Does anybody have additional closing remarks?
No official closing remarks. If there's no questions after this, know that there is a closing survey when they exit, and they could submit any questions there that I can share with the team. So,
Thanks.
mhm.
All righty. Well, thank you all, and we'll see you around.
Great. If that's
Thanks.
it. Thanks
Thank you,
everyone for
everybody.
attending. Appreciate everyone's
you.
time. Enjoy the rest of your day.